You might imagine that killing one man ends a movement. You might think the story of Hitler is a single bullet away from history rewinding. It's not that simple. The truth is a knot of ritual, routine, security, luck, and a personality wired for survival. The man you wanted to kill lived inside a machine designed to prevent his death. And that machine was as much social and psychological as it was physical. The very logic of his world made assassination extraordinarily difficult. From the outside, Hitler sometimes looked accessible. He went on parade routes. He made public appearances. He inspected troops. But behind every public step was an evolving web of protection. Elite SS escorts, layers of plainclothes agents, checkpoints, and a culture of secrecy that narrowed access to almost nobody. These units weren't ceremonial. They existed to think like potential assassins would think, to anticipate opportunities, and to close them down before they ever opened. Their remit was obsessive. Check, cross-check, control. That bureaucracy of protection turned ordinary doors into gates and small rooms into trials. Hitler's day-to-day routine also reduced odds. He liked predictability. He built rituals, certain conferences, some inspection routes, specific travel patterns. Predictability can make a leader vulnerable, and it did sometimes. But paradoxically, the routines were embedded inside an environment of constant adaptation. When a threat was suspected, routines changed fast. Every near miss taught the regime where it was soft. They hardened the next day. Security learned from its failures and closed the hole. That loop, attempt, failure, immediate tightening, is one reason plots failed in sequence, rather than succeeding after one lucky strike. Look at the actual attempts and you'll see the pattern. Plotters with courage and craft, undone by small practicalities, and the ruthless reflexes of a paranoid state. Georg Elser is the classic example of a near success turned by chance into a story of what if. Elser planted a time bomb in 1939 at the Burger Broikeler, where Hitler spoke every year. The bomb worked. Hitler left early. Elser was later caught, but the timing, a few minutes, a schedule change, saved Hitler. Little errors, not lack of intent, decided it. Across campaigns, devices failed to detonate, packages iced up on flights, guards moved briefcases, meetings ran short. Small facts, a gust of wind, a moved suitcase leg, a canceled trip, repeatedly turned murderable moments into missed opportunities. The July 20th, 1944 bomb, the famous Stauffenberg attempt, distills all those dynamics. The conspirators inside the Wehrmacht were brilliant and ruthless. They had a plan that went beyond murder. Operation Valkyrie would use the failed state contingency plan as a skeleton for a coup once Hitler was dead. Stauffenberg managed to sneak a bomb into the Wolfschanze, prime it, and position it at the Führer's table. But chance, architecture, and the highest human contingency conspired against them. When the bomb went off, a heavy oak table leg and an officer, Colonel Heinz Brandt, shifted the blast away from Hitler. The room's layout, the table's mass, and the briefcase's exact placement all diminished the explosion. Hitler suffered injuries, but survived. The plotters in Berlin, waiting for confirmation, misread the signals as success and moved early. Confusion and hesitation let the regime's communication channels reassert control. Within hours, the coup collapsed, and the reprisals were merciless. The moral is brutal and simple. In a life-and-death gamble, small geometry and timing beat strategy. But beyond mechanical failures and bad luck, there is Hitler's psychology, the thing that made him both remarkably exposed and staggeringly hard to kill. He was not an ordinary dictator who lived in public isolation. He combined public charisma with a private paranoia, a growing messiah complex that made him wary, suspicious, and more responsive to threats than he might appear. That paranoia created a feedback loop. He trusted very few, and those he trusted were surrounded by layers of loyalists who had everything to lose from his death. The network of loyalty around him was partly ideological, officers who saw Hitler as Germany's destiny, and partly self-protective, men who feared the legal and moral consequences of a power vacuum. The sociological reality is this. You didn't just have to kill one man. You had to defeat an entire web of belief and interest that supported him. A recurring theme among plots was the moral or social inhibitions of potential killers. Many conspirators were Prussian officers who thinly balanced honor, duty to the army, and revulsion at Nazi crimes. Some hesitated, some turned away because assassination felt like murder rather than a rescue. That hesitation mattered. You need decisiveness to execute a plan in 30 seconds. Second-guessing defeats even the best plot. In several cases, plans to shoot Hitler at airfields, to rig his plane, senior officers balked. They could conceive of removing Hitler but feared civil war, retribution, or the collapse of order. The result was a resistance that wanted to do what was right for Germany, but often lacked the ruthlessness or unity to pull it off. Another obstacle was access. Even if you were inside Germany and inside the Wehrmacht, being physically close to Hitler was a different thing altogether. His inner circle rotated with alternating access. His staff and SS units filtered visitors. Gifts or packages were thoroughly checked. Meetings with him were arranged with a choreography that marginalized risk. You could have the motive, the means, and close personal hatred, but if you didn't penetrate the immediate orbit, the rooms where Hitler held private councils, you had only fantasy. Those who came closest were people who already wore uniforms and whose presence was normalized. Officers, top ministers, trusted aides. But normalization also bred suspicion. Hitler's aides were often vetted for loyalty and origin. That extra layer of gatekeepers made any intimate, impulsive attack nearly impossible. Technologies of protection mattered too. Bombs sometimes failed because of temperature and design. Stauffenberg's detonator was a crude chemical pencil fuse that did what it could in humid cold or in an airplane hold, where ice could stop a mechanism. Attempts to poison him were complicated by his odd eating habits and by the number of attendants who watched everything. Guns, the classic assassin's tool, faced the problem of crowds, armored cars, and the immediate presence of armed SS men. More modern attempts at small-scale sabotage failed because the regime had trained thousands of eyes to spot odd behavior. Killing Hitler wasn't a matter of finding a gun. It was finding one tiny opening in a system designed to close openings at the first sign of air. Then there's the political domino effect that every assassin would have to anticipate. Even if you killed Hitler in public, who would control the narrative the next hour? The Nazi state had built contingency protocols and loyal institutions. The SS, the Nazi Party, and an obedient police apparatus could marshal a crackdown almost instantly. For many officers inside Germany, the fear that assassination could trigger a coup by even worse extremists, or civil war between SS and army, was real. The conspirators who eventually tried in 1944 had a plan: Valkyrie. It was ingenious because it used formal legal instruments to compete for power. But the plan depended on rapid communication and the illusion of certainty, and when the assassination failed, or when the aftermath produced ambiguity, the normal instruments of power reasserted themselves brutally. When the regime could claim continuity, it crushed opposition with legal political ferocity. You also have to weigh Hitler's luck. He survived because of small, improbable convergences. At the Wolfschanze, the table and a man's foot shielded him. On other occasions, flights were postponed, parades rerouted, or public speeches moved. Hitler wasn't immortal. He simply had a run of improbable survivals amplified by a regime that learned and adapted from each failure. That's crucial. After every attempt, the regime tightened, changed schedules, added guards, and revised protocols. Every failure taught the machine to be better. Over time, the number of viable windows decreased until assassination became a matter of astronomical luck or extraordinary inside collaboration. Personality mattered too in subtler ways. Hitler's charisma made people willing to risk punishment for proximity. His aides coveted the chance to be close, to be visible. That created a paradoxical risk acceptance. People liked being near him, and thus exposed themselves when they otherwise wouldn't. Yet those same emotional attachments could produce human errors that saved him. An aide stepping in front of a briefcase, an adjutant moving a prop, a meeting running shorter than expected. These human emotional acts are tiny things, but in assassination calculus they amplify into survival. The human dimension of loyalty and error is unpredictable enough that it undercuts any plan built purely on technical mechanics. There's another moral to the story: the nature of resistance in Germany. Many people who hated Hitler did not hate him enough to kill him themselves. Many who plotted wished to preserve German institutions and saw assassination as risky, morally complex, and potentially catastrophic. The social fabric of opposition was fractured by class, by fear, and by the very consequences they feared. After failed attempts, the regime's reprisals were immense. Thousands arrested, thousands executed. The cost of a failed plot was not only personal, it was a blow to any emerging network of resistance. That deterrent effect cannot be overstated. Potential conspirators had lives and families and careers. They weighed the probable outcomes and often concluded that paralysis was the safer path. Imagine trying to coordinate a murder that required secrecy at a dozen levels, a bomb that had to survive temperature and handling, corroborating coups in Berlin, sympathetic magistrates and police refusing to arrest coup actors, radio stations switching to the conspirators' control, commanders across divisions following new orders. That is not an assassination. That is a revolution packed into 60 minutes. Stauffenberg and his group came as close as history records, but they were still hostage to small contingencies: a misplaced briefcase, a misinterpreted report, a delayed phone call. The sequence shows why a plan that combined murder and immediate government collapse was more fragile than anyone admitted. Finally, there's the afterlife of failure. The terror that followed every attempt hardened the regime and sterilized future action. The nightmarish scale of reprisals for the July 20th conspirators, thuggish public executions, wave after wave of arrests, sent a message. The regime had both the motive and the capacity to eradicate organized opposition. The price of failure was total. That knowledge bled back into the military and civilian calculations and shrank the pool of those willing to act. When possibility contracted that far, assassination required not only courage and planning, but an extraordinary tolerance for collective catastrophe. Most people, even those who hated Hitler, were not willing to risk that. So why couldn't you assassinate Hitler? Because he was not merely a man, he was the center of a tightly woven organism. He lived in a culture that learned from each death attempt, a structure of protection that hardened with every near miss, and a psychological ecosystem, loyalty, fear, and belief, that insulated him. You would have had to pierce durability on 5 levels at once: technology, timing, access, political aftermath, and the human factor. Fail anyone, and the rest will swallow the attempt. History proves it was not incompetence that protected him. It was adaptation, luck, and the moral complexity of those around him. If you still picture a single shot solving everything, imagine instead the 1,000 small decisions you would have had to win in sequence. The exact moment when a guard shifts, the table leg that stays put, a meeting that lasts long enough, a detonator that doesn't freeze, a radio operator who flips the right switch at the right minute, officers who obey orders without hesitation. History is a litany of tiny, decisive details. Hitler survived because those details lined up against his killers far more often than for them. In the end, assassination attempts tell you less about Hitler's invulnerability and more about the fragility of resistance. Their stories are brave, tragic, and instructive. They teach how systems adapt, how small human acts can change outcomes, and how moral courage alone isn't enough without the brutal engineering of timing and infrastructure. You couldn't assassinate Hitler because killing him demanded changing history in an instant. And changing history requires more than a plan. It requires an almost impossible convergence of luck, will, and structural collapse. The closest conspirators failed not because they were cowardly or inept, but because they faced a regime that had learned, adapted, and shut the doors before the light could get through.